Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give a couple of minutes for any latecomers to join, as we've got over 40 people registered, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll just start in a couple of minutes. Right, okay. So let me just... Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Peggy Polonis today. Dr. Peggy is now a board member here at ECIS, so I'm very happy to be working with her more closely. I'm just going to share her official bio momentarily, but before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I hear about Peggy. Whenever I speak to people, what Peggy embodies is being a wonderful role model to many women and other leaders in international education. So thank you, Peggy. Dr. Peggy Polonis is the president at ECIS Athens. She's an educational leadership trainer, a licensed family therapist, also a certified in educational leadership from the Harvard Business School. Her doctoral work in educational leadership from the University of Bath here in the UK focused on the complexities of professional development in international schools. She's devoted to facilitating positive change. Peggy has developed a process of change model to help individuals strengthen the skills they need to cope with ongoing and global changes. Her work in international schools also includes many speaking engagements. She has spoken at the United Nations New York, the World Innovation Summit in Education, and the Alliance for Educational Leadership. She is the author of numerous professional journals and articles in education and has published 3 books on change and resilience. Wow, welcome, Peggy. We only have about 12 people with us, but like I said, we've got just under 50 people registered and lots of people watch the recordings afterwards. So let me hand over to Chad first.
Thank you so much, Cam. Chad, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Cam. I was just going to say also, Peggy's on the ECIS Student Support SIG, which we kind of branded as inclusion, which encompasses academic, social, emotional, and behaviors. And we've been working really hard on trying to plan a conference for the spring. And so we're really excited about that. And I'm just excited to listen to Peggy's presentation here. So thank you, Peggy.
Thank you very much, Chad. And it's really great to be with all of you. And what an honor for me to be on the ECIS board and working so closely with Cam and everyone else, Sarah and everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm hoping that we will do an exercise that will be a little bit more personal to you, to each of you. If you feel comfortable turning on your cameras, that would be great, so that we can, as we move along and you use your chat to go through this process, that would be wonderful. But I wanted to first kind of extend this to you. I'd like to know who you are, where you're from. Just tell us a little bit about where you are now in the world and what you do as we introduce ourselves, and then we'll move right into the topic. And I think, Cam, we have an hour, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So shall we start right next to chat as I see you? I think that's Caroline there. You're on mute, Caroline.
You're still on mute, Caroline.
Oh, sorry, yeah. I'm Caroline, the ECIS membership manager, and I'm in London today.
Wonderful. How's the weather there?
It's lovely at the moment. It looks very sunny out there.
The sun is finally out.
Yes.
That's Sarah next, recovering. Sarah, how are you doing?
Hi. I'm in Heathrow Airport, so I'm a bit kind of public here.
Yeah, I see that. Now I
I'm
see your note.
absolutely thrilled to be able to at least passively take part in your webinar today, Peggy. I need it. I need to work out how to deal with all this change.
Thank you, Sarah. There's Hara there.
Hi, everybody. I'm an inclusion specialist. Nice to meet you all. Looking forward to listening to our discussion today.
And then Benjamin.
Hi, I'm Ben Lind, and I'm a PYP coordinator at the European Azerbaijan School in Baku.
And Chris.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Padakis. I'm the co-chair for the inclusion group with Chad. Thank you, Peggy, for doing this for us. I was at ECIS for nearly 40 years, and now I'm a consultant. Looking forward to dealing with change.
And yes, and still working with ACS. Amira.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amira Zaki from Jordan. I'm an English teacher from Ra'ad Al-Arabi School.
Great. Now I don't see the other cameras on, but just let me see. Isabel. Or Alexandra or Paul. There's Isabel. Ah, there you go. Isabel, you're on mute. How about you, Alexandra, while Isabel comes back on? Oh, we have
Hi,
two
can you
there.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I'm Alexandra. I'm a teacher and early years curriculum coordinator at BEPS International School in Belgium. I'm currently on maternity leave since I don't know if you can see me, but I'm holding my baby who just fell asleep. So I'm hoping to be at least a good listener today.
So that's a big change that hopefully you'll walk through in your head as we do this. Isabel, are you there? I know you came on a couple times with your camera. There you go. Isabel, do you want to tell us a couple of things about yourself? Okay, let's, and how about Priya? Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, Priya Shah. I'm at the International School of Kenya. I'm the high school learning support case manager for grade 11 and 12. Looking forward to this webinar. Thank you.
Great. I think that's everybody on the screen at least. So let me just jump right in. And I don't know, can you see the PowerPoint presentation on the screen?
Yes,
everybody?
we can.
Great. All right. So let's start with this idea of why change takes courage, as I'm trying here to navigate my my screens because I have two of them. So let me just give me a minute. Having a hard time going into the second screen. There we go. Okay. Why I want you to think about a couple of things. And as we go through this process, first of all, why we're going to talk about why change takes courage. Why do we need courage in order to tackle change? We're going to talk about a process of change that has about 5 stages that pretty much when we experience change in our lives or initiate change in our lives, we all go through this same process. From my background in psychology, I had an opportunity to study this and also to experience this with many of my clients. So we all go through this same 5-stage process of change. The way, however, we each experience this process and these stages is very unique to each one of us. And it depends on a number of things. That's a workshop all in itself, but it depends on a number of things, mainly the kind of mindsets that have been developed through our experiences, through our role models, through the way that we have coped in the past. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So everybody experiences this process of change in different ways, though everyone will go through those 5 stages. So we're also going to talk about how we cope with change. And so, okay. Now, we all know, we've heard this before, that change is a constant in our lives. Our lives are constantly changing. The world is constantly changing. And as a result, education is changing, particularly nowadays with the technological changes that are, that we're experiencing. Change is happening very quickly and at multiple levels simultaneously. And globalization is bringing these changes to our doorstep every single day. So as a result of all this, or in conjunction with all this, education is changing, as it has always been changing. However, is changing at a more rapid rate, quicker, and at different levels continuously. And so the result of all that is that our learners are changing. And if our learners are changing, then our leaders, we as leaders, and when I say leaders, I talk about, teachers are leaders in the classroom, counselors are leaders in their area, administrators are leaders. So talk about leadership in a broader sense of the word. So therefore, leaders also have to change in order to address the changing needs of education and the changing learner. And so, yes, change is a constant in our lives. But again, it's happening faster and faster and at different levels continuously. What does this mean? It means that the world is now demanding a higher levels of education, training individuals at higher levels to be able to adjust to, not only adjust to the changes, cope with the changes, but also to be ahead of the changes, and many times to initiate change, because we ourselves as leaders in education have to be able to initiate many of these changes so that we manage this change and help others manage the change. And we have a say as to where education is going. So what does this do? It puts a higher demand on us psychologically. Psychologically, we begin to feel this stress more than ever. And so, one of the greatest human needs is the need to belong and to feel safe. This is something that is innate. This is something we're born with. We have a very strong need to belong and to feel safe. So nowadays, we're asking ourselves the question, where do we belong? Where do we feel safe in the midst of such uncertainty and so many changes around us that are unpredictable in many ways? So I want to invite you all to engage in a thought experiment today and think about the changes that have happened in the last few years. The world changed, you were asked to change, our students had to change, teaching had to change, and our lives continue to change as we slowly come out of the experiences that we've had in the last 3 years. But again, at the same time, not really certain how we're coming out of this and where we're going. So as you're engaging in this thought experiment, this is a question that we are always asking ourselves as educators and as leaders. What kind of learner do we want to promote? What kind of learner do we want to develop? What kind of individual do we want to send out into the world? Having learned what? What kind of habits of mind do we want our learners to have? What kind of actions do we want them to take? And when we answer that question of the type of learner that we want to have, then we ask ourselves, what kind of learning should be taking place in order for this kind of learner to develop? What does this kind of learning look like? And I think organizations like ECIS are very, are experts at answering these kinds of questions and providing the kind of professional development out there that is necessary to be able to answer these questions for each individual, individual school. But what happens in this kind of learning? What does it look like? How does it show in the world? how do students transfer this kind of learning in the outside world? So these are some things I want you to just ponder in your mind as we go along. And so if once we have an idea of the kind of learner and the kind of learning that we want to take place, then what kind of leadership do we need to create? What kind of leader do we need to be? What kind of teacher reflects this kind of learning? What are some of these shared values that we should have? What are the habits of mind that we as leaders should possess in order to encourage and empower this kind of learning? What should leadership look like? Is leadership in the classroom, in the school, in activities, in every aspect? And so these are the kind of questions that we ask ourselves under normal circumstances. But what about when change just kind of takes us by surprise and it's thrust upon us? How do we answer these questions? So let me go back to the idea of change and why it's so difficult. And why, well, first of all, change is difficult because it's really important in life to feel that at least some aspects of our lives we can control, and particularly the ones that we're in charge of. So if we're in charge of a school, if we're in charge of a classroom, if we're in charge of an organization, we want to feel that to some degree we are in control. So when change takes us by surprise, that idea of being in control goes out the window. It just, it's very difficult to feel like we're stepping on solid ground. And so it's a natural tendency for individuals to resist change. And so we know that when change comes our way or when it's initiated by someone else, it's individuals, we tend to resist, initially at least, the change that is coming our way. We want the familiar. We want what we know. We want the comfortable, the predictable. That's a natural tendency in human beings. And to the degree to which we resist the change depends on how large the change is, how we have learned to cope in the past, how invested we are in the status quo, what we call the status quo, and so on and so forth. So it's common knowledge that resisting change is kind of a natural human tendency. But here's the thing, that even change that is for the better, we often tend to resist it. Even if we intellectually know that this is probably going to be better, initially we will resist that change. Because again, it's not familiar. We don't know what we're going into. We don't know what this change is going to bring. Of course, we can get excited about it, but we still want to feel safe and belonging. And the change disrupts this process. So in this particular case, I want to use the idea of ducks as a metaphor. Ducks, duck stories tell us about mindsets. We use that expression, I'd like to have all my ducks in a row. And I know that if I have all my ducks in a row, if I have everything planned out, if I've thought of every solution, every way to tackle this, have it well organized in my mind and practically, then everything will be okay. That's a mindset that we develop over time. And the more organized we are, the more we have our ducks in a row, the more predictable life will be. The more in control we will feel. And ultimately, we will feel safe and a sense of belonging. But sometimes it's not easy to have all our ducks in a row. So I get anxious. I worry about that. I start to think, oh my gosh, my ducks must be in a row. If they're not in a row, if I don't have everything planned out, if everything doesn't work out the way I've planned it, I'm not okay. I'm going to start worrying about it and I'm going to be anxious about it. So the mindset says, Make sure all your ducks are in a row and life will be okay. Life will be predictable. Life will be comfortable. In other situations, I might get frustrated. I might get angry because I know that I've taught all my ducks to stay in a row, but yet they won't stay. So I've taught my students to do certain things. I've taught my faculty to do certain things. I've taught my groups to do certain things, but they just won't listen. They're not staying in a row. So that could create some frustration and anger in me. I keep trying to put all my ducks in a row, but sometimes these ducks, they just keep getting out of the row. You know, they want to do their own thing. Kids will be kids. They'll do their own thing. There will be faculty who won't, you know, follow along all the time. There will be people in the group who just don't agree. And so, you know, I keep telling myself, but I taught everybody to stay in a row and they're not doing this. So after a while, I keep trying to bring them back and put them in a row and they're not coming back. And I might give up. I might say to myself, what's the point? You know, I've taught them to do this. They're not doing this. Something must be wrong with me or something must be wrong with them. Or in any case, this is just not working and I'm just going to give up. And that's a, you know, feeling, an issue that has come up a lot during the pandemic and especially after the pandemic. But sometimes if we're taught to look at one duck at a time, what works? One or two ducks at a time. What is really working out there? Let's look at that and let's build on that, because we can't build on weaknesses. We can only build on strengths. And sometimes if I take a look at one duck at a time or two ducks at a time, and they're in a row, usually two ducks are in a row, then that might give me a sense of joy for that moment. And I can build on that sense of joy. And finally, if I change that mindset to think, you know what, ducks are going to be ducks. Kids are going to be kids. You know, teachers are going to do what they believe, you know, they want to do. And I don't have to have them in a row at all times. Okay. But at least they're all in the same pond. At least they're in this school. We have a common vision. We have common values, or they're in this organization. We're working towards a common goal. And right now that's pretty good. And if I can get one more duck in a row, great. But if I don't, I'm not going to, you know, develop feelings of hopelessness about that. I'm just going to focus on what works. So ducks have a story to tell. And I think in that sense, they help us to understand that, you know, not everything, and particularly during the pandemic, could be in a row. And whether it was or it wasn't our fault, or, you know. And I think during the pandemic, everyone in their own way rose to the occasion. They really, you know, were able to respond to the uncertainty and the difficulty of what this brought our way. So I think there are many, many successes that we can talk about. But as we think about leading and managing, I just want to make a side note to say here that 80% of whatever we do in leading an organization, in leading our classroom, is usually management. And about 20% is leadership. Now, what does that mean? It means that that 20% is extremely important. If in that 20%, the vision is clear, the rules are clear, the values, the common values, there's an understanding of common values, there's agreements that, you know, everybody understands, then the managing becomes easier, because things like the pandemic and on smaller scales will continuously come our way. How many of you, you know, are putting out fires on a daily basis and, you know, managing situations when you're thinking, you know, I should be doing more of, you know, leading, I should be doing so and so. But if that 20% is really clear and there's a clear understanding among all stakeholders of what the vision is, what the goals are, where we're going, what we're really doing, what the purpose of what we're doing is. What is our purpose? What is our why? Then the managing becomes easier. So now let's go. Anybody, any questions so far before we move on to the process of change? Yeah. Okay. I said earlier that change is not easy, and that we as human beings have a tendency to resist change. So I'd like you to walk through this with me. I'm going to walk you through the 5 stages of change and try to make it as personal to you as possible within this next half hour. I'd like you to think of a time in your life in the last 3 years, if possible, or even prior to that, if something has stayed with you in relation to a change in your life. Think about a change in your life that you have gone through that was difficult. That was a challenging change. Now, the most obvious here is, of course, the pandemic, but it doesn't have to be that, because there are many other challenging changes that people have gone through in their lives, you know, whether, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a painful change. For example, a loss, a divorce, you know, breakup of a relationship, whatnot, illness, things like that. It doesn't have to be that, although usually those are the ones that are very impactful in our lives. It could be something positive, getting married, having children, you know, a child, which is a major change in our lives that changes our lives greatly. But I want you to think about that change for a moment. And I'd like you to go to the stage before the change took place, whether it was a change that came in your life or whether you initiated the change. And I'd like you for a second to think about, what was it like before the change came into your life? Just what were some of the words to describe the time before the change? If you could just put those words in the chat, that would be great. You think about that for a second. Scary. Now this is before the change. Anxious. Stressed out. Caroline, taking normal for granted. Yes. Curious, upsetting. Was anybody feeling comfortable? At times sad, but independent, calm. Okay. All right. So this is the first stage of change, which I call this is a status quo. And the status quo could be something good or not so good. Okay. But typically is something that is very familiar, that is comfortable, could be good or bad, could be boring, it could be predictable. Here's the thing to know about, and it could be a very bad situation as well, okay? But it still could be familiar and predictable. I know how to cope, you know, I've learned how to cope with it. It might not be optimal. It might not be the best situation. It might be toxic, but I've learned how to cope with it, and I'm here and it's familiar and it's predictable. And so, but here's the thing to know about the status quo and why change is so difficult. The status quo pulls us to it like a magnet. And if we were doing this workshop now in person, I would really take you through an exercise to see how strong the status quo is and pulls us, even if it is not the best situation to be in. Because in our minds, it's familiar and it's comfortable and it's predictable. In our heads, we may know that we want out. We may know that we want something better, but our whole being wants to be in the status quo. It pulls us like a magnet. It's really, really, really strong. All right, now, as you think about your change, you're in the status quo. You're going back in memory to the status quo, the time before the change. And then all of a sudden, the change happens. Or maybe it wasn't sudden. Maybe in your life, it was something that you had been thinking about, that you initiated, or you knew was coming and it came along. But that moment, day, time when the change happened or it was initiated, what did that feel like? Can you write some things on the chat about that? What was that like? Too much routine. And so, Caroline, what happened when the change came? Unpredictable, shock. Think about if you don't have uncomfortable. I was impatient. I wanted to sort everything out at once. Right, exactly. In the moment, I needed to maintain daily habits as well as possible. Excellent. A mix of feelings: excited, scared, happy, curious, controlling even. Yeah, those ducks really became prominent. Boredom, exactly. So I'm just going to use the pandemic as an example, as you have your own change in your mind. But here comes the second stage of change. This is of the process of change, rather. This is the foreign element. This is when change comes into our lives by surprise, or when we have initiated the change, but we weren't exactly sure of what to expect. And so surprise, shock, it could be exciting. It could be curiosity. It could be really looking forward to this. Wow, this is going to be wonderful. But yet I have this feeling in my stomach that I can't explain. And so what happens right then and there? My mind goes right back to the status quo, an immediate rejection of the change. Think about the pandemic. What did we say? Oh no, this is not happening. Or this is not gonna, it's gonna be okay. We're not gonna, what's this about? And so, or scared, afraid of what's ahead. What's gonna happen? Where's this gonna go? And so we immediately reject the processing of the change, and we want to go back to the status quo. We want to go back to homeostasis, to understand, to where we were, where it was comfortable. We wanted to know what was going to happen. Exactly. As Cam says, we were in denial. We're in denial because psychologically, what happens when we're in denial? Our brains are trying to make sense of the change so that we can best cope. And we don't want, it's too much to accept the change immediately. So we have to do it step by step because it's too overwhelming. And that's what denial is about. So our whole being wants to go back to what we knew. What did we kept asking? What did we keep asking ourselves throughout the pandemic? When are we going to go back to normal? When is life going to be back the way it was? How are we going to get there again? We wanted what we knew. And so in that way, the status quo was pulling us back to what was familiar and comfortable and so on and so forth. That was the foreign element. Now, let's think about the change once we got it, once we said, oh, the lockdown happened, or we started to teach online, or we were, I know here in Athens, we had to send messages every time to the government, every time to get permission, every time we wanted to go shopping in the supermarket or take a walk outside or whatnot. So we're in the midst of the change, right? But yet we had no idea what was coming, when this was going to end, what it would mean. Would life continue to be like this? Can we ever go back to normal? So if you think about that change in your life, in the beginning stages of that change, what was that like? What was that like once the change took form? Deeply upsetting and unsettling. It wasn't easy to see the positive in this in the beginning, was it? Okay, so you did a lot of research, planning for the future, developing new habits. So, and you can see from these responses that everybody's reaction to the change is going to be different. Yeah, change you don't want is always difficult to deal with. Getting organized, getting all my ducks in a row. That's how I feel I can be in control. Absolutely. What else was happening in the midst of the pandemic, in the beginning? What was the feeling that was coming out? Setting new goals? Fatalist, okay. I think earlier somebody said scary. Yep, completely lost, absolutely. Stepping into the unknown, and the unknown itself is scary. Yes, thinking about how to manage others and looking after them when we didn't even know where we were going. We were looking to people to give us the answers, and nobody had the answers. How scary is that? Nobody could tell us when it's going to end, how we're going to work this out. Skepticism towards others. That's right. Our trust levels changed, and we thought, okay, the government will tell us, somebody will tell us what to do, but it wasn't easy. As a mama, I always try to be positive and say it will be okay. But what was happening inside you? Having to reorganize, some ducks in a row and some letting go. Good point. Exactly. So this third stage of change, third stage conceptually, because really none of these, this process is not linear. But this third stage conceptually is the most difficult one to cope with. And this third stage is called chaos. The foreign element stage doesn't last very long because change happens and then we're immediately thrust into chaos. And a lot of different and conflicting things happen inside of us psychologically during the phase of chaos. We could have both positive and negative feelings, painful feelings and, optimistic feelings. And that's what's confusing about the chaos stage. So we might feel a disorganization, a disorientation, trying to find our ground again. Oftentimes we go on survival mode. So fight or flight. But during the pandemic, who can we fight? Where do we run away? There was nowhere to go. And so that chaos feeling of chaos became even more pronounced for many of us. A feeling of hopelessness and helplessness because we really didn't know what to do. And we knew no one who could tell us how to do it. And this is a time during the chaos phase where a lot of our old mechanisms of coping start to break down. They don't work the way they used to. We turn to our old ways of coping, but in this new situation, they're not necessarily as effective. We might feel fatigued because we're constantly trying to figure it out. And oftentimes mental fatigue and psychological fatigue is a lot more difficult than physical fatigue. Depression at times, a very normal response to this kind of situation. Loneliness, especially if you're a leader, if you're a teacher in a classroom, a leader of an organization, leader of a school, really a feeling of loneliness because just a sense of being alone. Yes, your team is there, but ultimately you have the responsibility. And so this phase of the change process can seem very dark. And so guess what? The status quo becomes more and more attractive during this time. The status quo starts to pull back very, very strong. We start to long for what we have, wish we could go back there, maybe appreciating what we had, wishing we could just go back, and so much more. And so chaos, think about what we had to do during the chaos phase in the pandemic. We had to make things work. We had to run our schools, run our organizations, figure it all out. And yet, chaos is the worst time to make any kinds of decisions because of this disorientation and disorganization. At the same time, the adrenaline could be very high, really helping us to move and just keep going. And so that's what helped us to figure it all out. That we just knew we had to keep going. There was nowhere to stop. Nobody was going to give us the answers, but we need to go, keep going. But it's not an easy phase. It's the most difficult phase. And it's the one phase where we need the greatest support. But typically during these darker times, we don't necessarily know how to reach out for support. We don't necessarily know what to ask for. And watching others go through their chaos phase, whether it's our children in the classroom, or our own children, or our partners go through their own chaos phase because of work issues, because of management issues, or whatever it is, personal, is very, very difficult, as everybody goes through their phase in their own way, and oftentimes feeling helpless that we can't help them go through it, because everybody goes through this phase pretty much alone in their own way. So now think about if you have come out of, for the most part, of the change in this life. So if we're thinking about the pandemic, we're coming out of the pandemic now, right? If you're thinking of a different change in your life, have you come out of that change? Are you still within that change? But as you're moving out of the chaos, what does that feel like, or did that feel like? When they said to us, no more lockdowns, when they said to us, you don't need to teach online anymore, you can come back in person, you can have your conference in person, what did that feel like? Relief. Yeah. What else did that feel like? Happiness, grateful, back to normal life, disbelief, right? An opportunity to change some stuff, hope. Great. So here's the fourth phase of change, an overall sense of pride. I love that one. It's a new hope. We're starting to come out of the chaos, and the status quo is pulling less and less now. It's a new way of being, new hope. And it's kind of like we have to figure this out, new opportunities, exactly. But you know what? We've been through the worst of it. And now we have a new sense of empowerment. Still, we're still walking on eggshells. We're still wondering how it's all going to turn out. But we think, well, we've been through the worst of it now. We can certainly do this by putting one foot in front of the other, practicing the new behaviors. Really a renewed kind of hope. It's not going to be like before, it's going to be different, but I think I can figure it out. A sense of, you know what, I can do this. And my coping mechanism start to kick in again. Though I do have to say that we're going to see a lot of post-trauma right now after the pandemic, because the adrenaline is coming down. We're now looking back and thinking, you know, what did we go through? And we're going to see a lot more of this in children, in families, in our own, you know, in our people, in our teachers, and so on and so forth, because along with the pandemic, there were other losses as well. But the status quo doesn't pull as strongly anymore. Now we're more in the mindset of, okay, now we know how to do this. Let's keep going, even though we might be exhausted, even though we might, still have obstacles, even though we still have some uncertainty, but we're going to figure this out because we figured out the worst of it. And so the last phase, think about having gone through this process and all of the learnings that you've integrated into your personality, the new things that you have, put into your repertoire, whether it was teaching or leading or managing or whatever it was. So now there's a richer repertoire for which to work from. And so now the last phase comes where we are there. We've done it. We've come through it. What is that like? What kind of feelings come along with that sense of, I've done this? I think earlier Cam said pride, sense of pride. Somebody said a sense of pride. That's one of those feelings. Yes, a sense of pride that I've done this and I will be okay. What else? Relief. I was one of the lucky ones. Yes. Proud. Mm-hmm. A sense of, I can do this. I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. Resilient. It may not be the easiest thing to cope with, but I'll figure it out. And that is the final stage of change, an integration, where we integrate all that we have learned. Survival, yes, we feel like we've survived, all that we have experienced, and now it becomes part of our personality, mindset, way of coping. A sense that it will be okay. If I can get through this, I can get through anything. And sometimes, yes, a sense of empowerment, even joy, where we see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So at this point, when we get to the end of this process, a new status quo is developed. And because it's richer, it includes more experiences, different coping, different way of being, different mindset, not completely, because our DNA is still, we're still incorporating all the past there, but new things have come in to our repertoire. And so it's a new status quo. And I just want to make a little note here that during the pandemic, first of all, I think that the hardest job in the world is being a parent because it's 24/7. But I think teaching is the second hardest job in the world because it includes parenting in many ways. And when I say teaching, I mean in any capacity, whether it's, workshops, organizations, schools, whatnot. And in this case, think that as teachers, leaders, whatnot, we also had to be parents. And in many ways, we also had to be parents to ourselves because during the pandemic, because no one had the answers and we were moving in the unknown, we also became children. The fear in us came out. The uncertainties, made us children again. And so, yes, we acted like adults. We kind of figured it out as we went along. We thought about this, but deep down, there was that same sense of fear and insecurity that children experience. And so just a little note very quickly here, because I know we're getting towards the end of this, but I just want to say this, that children particularly, and we as children, when we were children are good observers, but bad interpreters up until the age of 7, particularly. when we haven't yet developed the idea of thinking logically, a critical mind. And so we interpret all of the experiences around us as related to us, and we interpret them according to our own context and our own experiences. Oh, mommy was mad at me today because mommy was mad today, it must be my fault, kind of thing. So we develop a private logic. I won't go deeply into this because this is a whole other workshop, but we develop a private logic that follows us throughout our lives. So when we, at times of crisis, go back to being children, we tap into this private logic that is not necessarily rational. It's all based on feelings and experiences and interpretations that we have made when we were very young. We also cope by watching adults. And so, and that's how we develop our sense of belonging and feeling loved. If in a particular environment that we grow up in, we feel that we belong and we are loved, then we feel safe. If this doesn't happen, then we don't necessarily feel safe. And so our private logic is developed depending on that context. So during COVID times, and particularly after COVID, children now experienced certain things at home, anxiety that parents were experiencing, losses that, and so on and so forth. And now we see higher levels of stress among young people. They're more restless and grumpy. They're not as motivated as they used to be. Many of them could be more aggressive because they're scared or, are scared. They're sad, depressed. They withdraw more, and they have a lot of gaps. And they also have physical reactions. This is the after the pandemic situation. And if you pay attention to what you're experiencing inside, you may also feel some of these things as well, now more than during the pandemic, because now we have time to think about it. Now we have time to, then we didn't have a whole lot of time to stop and think about it. We maybe have been experiencing it, but we didn't have time to really stay with it. But now looking back, we may. So children will cope as well as we do. And the hardest part for them was the lack of routine. But for many parents, it wasn't easy to have this routine and to set those boundaries during the pandemic. So children learned to be without this throughout the pandemic. So now here we are trying to bring them back in place. And remember that we expected children to respond as if it was a normal situation. We expected them to study like they used to. We expected them to pay attention in class, online. We expect them to turn in their homework, to meet deadlines, to respond to an unnatural situation in a natural way. And that just wasn't the case. So now it's time to really retrain them, to really take time to let them know what the expectations are, what the boundaries are, make agreements with them, and so on and so forth. And so one of the ways to do this is by using encouragement as opposed to praise, because praise happens when someone has already accomplished something. And so the message oftentimes there can be discouraging, because when you tell somebody, good for you, you did this, that what a great person you are for accomplishing this, that can be very discouraging. Whereas encouragement takes place during. So even if somebody falls, and the idea is to help them get up, even if somebody, if we recognize the effort, that's encouraging. And I think the most important thing to remember is that they're all trying to cope as we're trying to cope. And oftentimes it's our own anxiety that we are projecting rather than theirs. And as adults, as I said before, we're supposed to know what to do. But remember, we're also scared. We need a safe place to belong. We need to vent. We need to discuss. We need to create these spaces intentionally we need to be acknowledged. We need to acknowledge those around us. We need to celebrate together. We need to have a sense of we are in this together, and we may not know where we're going, but we're going to figure this out together. We need to have common goals, the why. We need to understand the why. Where are we going and why are we doing this? What's our higher purpose? We need, we can do, one of the things that has worked for me in the past is doing behavior over time graphs, which means you take a look at a situation, how things were last year, how things were the year before, how things are this year, and graph that and see what has changed over time. It's really also very important to provide people with continuous feedback. Doesn't matter if it's negative feedback, as long as they're getting some kind of feedback so that they know where they stand and what the goal is, where they need to go. Because remember, in the face of uncertainty, we all become kids. Now, this is just a depiction of the process of change. Remember what I said, it's not linear. We often have, 2 steps forward, 5 steps backwards, and so on and so forth, until we figure it all out. And the coping all depends on our unique personality, unique coping style, unique mindset. But here we start with status quo, new element, chaos, new behaviors, and then integration. And that's kind of what happens inside of us. And just as a final note here, before I just kind of open it up to questions, I have this image of a fractal here, because I like to use the image of a fractal as something that reflects every part of the whole. So meaning, if you look at the fractal here, this one piece looks like the whole. So if you think of an organization or a school or a classroom as a fractal, the ultimate vision of the organization or school or classroom should be reflected in every part of the school or the organization, in meetings, in workshops, in collaborative projects, and so on and so forth. The language that people speak should be reflected in the smaller, I shouldn't say smaller, or in the different areas, just as it is in the whole. And that's where it's important for people to understand. That's why it's important for people to understand the why, the goal, where we're going, and to have a voice in how we're going to get there. So that's the idea of change and why change needs courage. And I just, at this point, just want to open it up and see if you have any questions. I think we're just about time, right, Cam?
Yes, we are. That was fascinating. Thank you so much.
And just any comments in your chat, questions, or ideas to ponder. Thank you, Ms. Perakis. Thank you, Alexandra.
Well, we will be sharing this recording with the people that registered and all the people that normally register for these talks. Thank you so much. That was really reflective and really made us think about where we've been and where we're going.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today, and all the best to all of you through the changes in your lives and in your profession.
Thank you, Benjamin. It was really nice to read your comments today as well.
Thank you. I was happy to be here.
Great to meet you. All right. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you.
Bye. Bye-bye.